Thank you to all the members for supporting my channel. Hi there! Through the last month or so, I've been looking through a lot of the characters throughout all of Genshin Impact's history, because I kinda have to for the research for my more recent videos. Because believe it or not, when you're talking about the biggest meta breakers in Genshin, you kinda have to have a little bit of a reason as to why they were as overpowered as they were on release. And with that all being said, there's been a little trend that I've noticed a lot. There are times where a character is unbelievably ridiculously overpowered, and then over the course of their debut, they end up becoming what is essentially just completely irrelevant. Or maybe not completely irrelevant, but essentially just a shadow of their former selves. And that gave me an idea for a new series, talking about the biggest fall-offs in Genshin Impact's history. And I had a very, very good idea as to who the very first person of the video could be. The biggest, most well-known fall-off in all of Genshin. A surprising one to a few because he is an Archon of all characters. One of my favorite units in the game, Mr. Animo Archon Venti himself. Where do I even begin with you? You see, a lot of people who play Genshin Impact didn't really play in the very early eras of the game. I would argue that a significant majority of the people that play Genshin to this day are probably players that started at around 2.0 or onward. A lot of people didn't really get to experience the version 1.0 hype. And consider yourself lucky for that, because it was not all it was cracked up to be. On Genshin's release, we only had a handful of limited time characters. We knew about Ayaka, we knew about Zhao, we knew about Klee, and we knew about Venti. However, Venti was the only one of the three who wasn't playable until the game released. Upon Genshin Impact's debut, the very first limited time banner had this really interesting bard boy on it, who a lot of the community later found out was the Animo Archon, which in hindsight, that should have been very, very obvious considering how ridiculously overpowered Venti was. Venti was not a DPS, but he might as well have been, because Venti was able to pump out a lot of damage with very little investment with the use of his elemental burst. Drawing back his bow, Venti would fire an arrow of condensed animo energy that would explode into a massive vortex, sucking in everything around it, and, of course, infusing it with an element assuming electro, hydro, pyro, or cryo were present. The burst, like a lot of animo elements in Genshin, would then take on the properties of this element, allowing it to deal additional instances of damage in the form of pyro, cryo, electro, or hydro depending on what you swirled. Venti's elemental skill was really nothing impressive. Just tapping the skill would cause a little burst of wind to shoot up underneath the target, dealing a pretty decent amount of damage, and then with the hold skill he would do a little bit more damage and cause a wind turret underneath you, which back in the day, this shit was fire for exploration. Not so much anymore, but you gotta remember, we were really strapped for decisions back then. Anyway, the reason why Venti was considered so ridiculously overpowered back in these days was because every single enemy, as long as they were not some kind of elite boss, was able to be sucked into Venti's burst, allowing him to deal large chunks of damage to very significant groups of enemies at the time. And because he was triggering a lot of swirl reactions, the more enemies that were clumped up together, the more damage he would deal. This created a little bit of a perpetual cycle, where if an enemy wasn't resistant to CC, they'd be sucked into the burst, which made Venti stronger because now he was swirling all the enemies and dealing even more damage. If you want an idea of how strong Venti was back in the day, please go to the Viridescent Venerer domain, start it up one time, and press your elemental burst button and watch as the round clears itself. Now take that and extrapolate it to the rest of the game, and that's what Venti was like. Venti was like the auto battle button in Star Rail, where you press one button one time and watch the numbers until everything is dead. And you know, speaking about the Viridescent Venerer domain, it's actually ridiculous how strong this set was for Venti, because let's be honest, it was very clearly made for Venti. It even shares his design, for God's sake. When Venti would have a full set equipped, he would receive a 15% animo damage bonus, which is whatever. But when you swirled an element, Venti would shred resistance for that element on the enemy who was swirled by it by 40%. Now this is actually a really big deal, not only for your teammates, because Venti would swirl everything together with pyro and now your Deluxe burst is going to one-shot everything in it, but it would also buff Venti's damage even more, because if he swirled pyro and shred pyro Pyro Res, then the Pyro Swirls that Venti's Elemental Burst was doing, which was well over half of them by the way, were going to be dealing significantly more damage. With all of these things stacked together, Venti was just so overpowered throughout all of Genshin's time frame that Whales would just tell you, hey, just don't level Venti. He's too strong, don't use him. You basically can't play the game if you have a Venti on your team, which is really funny. On top of that, Spiral Abyss at the time was very difficult because the most powerful floors in all of the Abyss were, unfortunately, defense floors. Yay! And if you did not have Venti for this, it was basically impossible to do these floors without him. It was to the point where people were having to use Geo Traveler and block off access from the Leyline deposit in order to fight back. And to this day, you can still go back to some of these videos and these people who are making them will be like, yeah, this is obviously going to assume you don't have Venti, because if you did, you won't be needing this tutorial. Because Venti was just that fucking strong. He negated the whole game. So what happened to Venti? He still does all the things that he used to do, so why is he considered a falloff? Why is he considered so weak? And it really comes down to the unfortunate circumstances of what the Spiral Abyss has become and the enemies that have released since Venti's debut. You see, on release, a lot of the enemies that existed in Genshin Impact were very small. Halochurls, Slimes, most Sison Mages, and Fatui were all affected by Venti's burst. The only things that weren't affected in some capacity were Ruin Guards, boss enemies, and Halochurls, and that was really it, which meant well over half of the roster and well over 70-80% of the roster that could show up in Spiral Abyss were going to die to Venti just by existing. So what miHoYo did was a couple of things. Morgana Comp was really powerful at the time. That was Ganyu, Venti, Mona, Diona. Morgana Comp. If I say it again, that's what I'm referring to. Well, this team was so overpowered because it combined the overwhelming DPS of Ganyu and the supportive capabilities of Venti, because Venti would give 15 energy of Cryo, assuming you infuse Cryo, back to the team, allowing you to spam burst while also getting Cryo Resistant Shred to just destroy everything, and Mona with TTDS on top of that, giving you a 36% attack bonus, pretty much just made the whole game cry before you. This team was the GOAT. And miHoYo, seeing this, decided that with the release of Inazuma, they were going to make enemies significantly resistant to CC effects, and this started with the Nagakiba. These are the samurai that appear on Inazuma. Nowadays, they can be sucked up by Venti. However, on release, they were about as resistant as Mitochurls, which are the bigger Halochurls. They would be sucked in, just very slowly. The samurai, the big samurai, completely immune. Spectres, completely immune. Like, pretty much every enemy after that was completely immune. And because pretty much all of Venti's damage is locked into his elemental burst, if he's not able to properly swirl it against an enemy, that's really it. That's GG. You're not getting any effect out of that burst. And while it is true that miHoYo did go back and retroactively nerf a lot of the CC resistant buffs they gave to the Inazuman enemies, it really doesn't matter that much in the grand scheme of things, because unfortunately, a lot of these characters just didn't really matter anymore. Who cares if you made it to where they're able to be affected by CC, when the Spiral Abyss at this point in time was nothing but bosses, and like I said, Venti cannot really swirl against boss enemies, which makes it to where there's really no use bringing Venti in at all when characters like Kazuha and Sucrose do a much better job at buffing the team without having to rely on this really janky burst. And yeah, even though their bursts aren't doing anywhere near as much as Venti's is, they're still more than powerful enough to give the team what they need to survive. And by survive, I mean the buffs are just absolutely ridiculous, so they're gonna be killing everything. So that kind of put Venti in this really weird spot where now he's just kinda okay. Like, Venti is still overpowered, don't get me wrong. If you can bring him into content where Venti actually works, he is still an instant win button. So why would I make this video talking about how he fell off? Well, the fact of the matter is, Venti used to be a character that you can bring into any content in the game at all and instantly win, and now he's not. And while at the end of these videos where I was gonna talk about Genshin's biggest fall-offs, I kinda wanted to take a moment to talk about how we could maybe improve these characters in the future, but I'm going to be honest, in Venti's case, I really don't think it's a good idea to make him any stronger than he is. Like I said earlier in the video, Venti's biggest power comes from his elemental burst, and his elemental burst is kept in check by the fact it doesn't work on every enemy. If it did, the entire game would be absolutely trivialized by his existence, and you could make the argument that it should do that because Venti is an Archon, and as it currently stands, Venti is a lot weaker than the rest of the Archons for his situational uses, but I would argue that in the situations where Venti is usable, he is the most overpowered powered character in the game to this day. And while those situations may be significantly less present than they used to be, I still think that it's a circumstance where he is just an instant win button. Like, the fact of the matter is, if you're new to the game and you're struggling to clear the Spiral Abyss, you could go in with a Venti at level 90 and probably effortlessly full clear half the chambers all the way up until chamber 11 with just a Venti. While he's not the overwhelmingly dominant force in the endgame that he used to be all the way back then, he's still powerful enough to carry you through the first 8 chambers of Abyss and all the way up to maybe chamber 11, depending on if it's a boss rotation or not. Making his elemental skill or elemental burst or really anything in his kit any stronger is just going to break the game, which puts Venti in a very weird spot. But still, he did fall the hell off, which is unfortunate. That all being said, tell me what you think about Venti. Like, comment, subscribe. See you all later. Peace.